Some things in my neighborhood stay empty forever. Now I know why. Part 2. By mid-morning, the potency of my pre-drawn revelation had known. I'd barely even seen the digging man. His firearm was probably an optical illusion. Ren's disturbing story, combined with the innate creepiness of abandoned spaces after nightfall, had taken root in my brain and mutated. Some buildings in my neighborhood stay empty forever. Now I know why. Part 2 by Nikki XX. By mid-morning, the potency of my pre-drawn revelation had known. I'd barely even seen the digging man. His spurred arm was probably an optical illusion. Ren's disturbing story, combined with the innate creepiness of abandoned spaces after nightfall, had taken root in my brain and mutated. Jenna was still asleep. I pulled out my laptop, anticipating a few good hours of binge-watching Orange is the New Black before the heat rendered the apartment uninhabitable, and I saw an unread email. It was from Adrian. Hey Millie, for starters, dude, when are we going out for that soju and bulgogi you promised me? Okay, where did you get those pages you sent me? Is it like Legitsky or just some ass messing with you? Because the writing is Enoch. I never had even seen anything written in Enoch before. I thought it was all fraud. A guy in my class is really into conspiracy theories. He lent me this Enochian dictionary. It's actually not that complicated once you get into it. And I've got the page translated. I think it's a religious text. From what I've done so far, it's about God and the creation of angels. You asked about the symbol on the cover. The squiggly 7 and N, you said. That's not Enoch. It's a Hebrew name for God. One of them. L. Not sure if it's for protection or what. I'm intrigued. Can you possibly lend me the book? I'd like to try and translate the rest of it. And one more time, Bulgogi. I've been subsisting on ramen and living vicariously through you. I immediately Googled Enoch. The language was discovered by two 16th century philosophers, John Dee and Edward Kelly. Kelly practiced the art of scrying, staring into a crystal ball for hours on end, torturing himself to near insanity, scribbling onto parchment what he saw in the translucent orb. He claimed he spoke to angels. He claimed that the shapes he scrawled into the sleepless stupor was the tongue of the angels, and he called his newly discovered language Enoch, after a biblical character who claimed to have visited heaven and experienced the visions of demons and giants. Kelly had been something of a Tudor-era con artist, but true believers argued that if Enoch was a fraud cooked up by Kelly, some potential benefit that had never been materialized, he would have needed to possess the linguistic genius necessary to develop a functioning language, on the spot, backwards. Then, centuries after Kelly's death, European occultists incorporated his Enoch etchings into a system of working magic. The night before, I'd been convinced Jenna and I needed to leave town. Between the digging homeless man, the mid-city mauler, and a bargain big booklet was written in a dialect from a fever mind of a Renaissance black magician. I had a lot of options to creep myself out, but in the bright, early fall daylight, I no longer felt the urge to run. A stronger force was operating within me. Lapel, divide, the call of the void. I thought about my photo/interview project. On the internet, scary hits harder than anything else, particularly scary based in reality. I decided to change focus. Rather than record cheerful anecdotes about how a retired Korean lawyer learned Spanish, I could braid the fact with rumor, speculation, and the scars of hysteria and come out with a bona fide urban legend of murder, cannibalism, occultism, and some cryptic tone. If that doesn't give any a following, I thought, I don't know what will. It took me a week to find my groove. I started by asking coffee bar and karaoke room acquaintances outright if they remembered the string of murders 10 years before, the victims of the Mid-City Mauler. The few who had been around long enough to remember immediately shut down and refused to talk. After that, I took what I thought was a more subtle approach. I'd asked them to describe the most notorious crime ever committed in the neighborhood. That, if anything, went over even worse. Employees would assure me that the neighborhood wasn't very safe. Older patrons assumed I was some sort of sadist. The 20-somethings invariably responded with tales of drive-by shootings and muggings that were more recent, more common, and more commonplace. Finally, I gave up trying to force details of the Mid-City Mauler out of people and simply asked, "What is the strangest thing that ever happened to you in Koreatown?" The answers I received weren't exactly what I expected, but in a way, they were better. I met Isabel outside a bakery on 7th Street. She and I shared the weakness for the green tea macarons. We sat at one of the little plastic tables at the back of the shop, sipping iced coffee and discussing the wretchedness of traffic since the metro construction. She's 27, a dialysis technician at St. Vincent, and has lived in the same building of St. Andrews for 5 years. The strangest thing that ever happened to me in Koreatown? She repeated my question. Okay, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but I saw a flock of pigeons a week ago that really freaked me out. Pigeons? I asked. Yeah, pigeons. I parked at the meter on Wilton, and I was walking to my apartment when I heard birds squawking. I thought it sounded like a flock of parrots. Why would there be a flock of parrots on Wilton? Isabel shrugged. It was coming from the trees. I looked up into the branches, and there were like tens of pigeons standing there, all cawing like parrots. Like parrots. Like parrots, I said, probably sounding more accusatory than I intended to. Yes, I used to work at the pet store. I know what a parrot sounds like. Pigeons and parrots do not make the same noise. And these were definitely pigeons. So I thought it was weird. I stared at the birds, and they shut up and stared right back at me, as though I know this sounds crazy, as though they'd been caught red-handed. And I don't know how to explain this, but the longer I stared at them, the more wrong they looked. It was like, what do you call it? Bridesmaid effect? The one where people look more attractive in a group than each one does individually? If I looked at the birds altogether, they were at your average flock of pigeons, but when I focused on one individual pigeon, the illusion fell apart. Their feathers were the wrong colors, their necks were too big, their wings tips looked puke green hue when they caught the light, and their eyes were too big. Our staring contest went on for maybe 10 seconds, then they flew away, awkwardly, like one flight and one kind of hovered. Then the others hopped in the air in twos of threes, bumping. Isabel sighed and took a sip of her coffee. Oh no, like the scariest thing they could have done was shit on me, and they didn't even do that. But I couldn't get those birds out of my head. Why did they call like parrots? And why were they all staring at me? I could see malicious little wheels turning behind their eyes. Daniel was my waiter at the gyro shop off of Vermont. He's 19, a student at Santa Monica College, and lives with his mother on 6th Street. When I asked him about the strangest thing he'd ever seen in the neighborhood, his answer was immediate and enthusiastic. A snake, he said excitedly. It was crazy. You don't just go out into the urban jungle and see snakes. I take Olympic when I walk to work, and I always pass by the same run-down store with signs in Korean. I think they brought old gold at one point. The place is all gated up. The windows are blacked out, and it's been empty as long as I can remember. Anyways, I'm on my way to work last Tuesday, and there's a snake there, wrapped right in front around the metal gate. I'm thinking to be an escape pet. It was a small snake, yellow with blue blotches and pure white eyes. I never seen a snake like that before. It looked something out of the rainforest. I stopped and watched the snake. I don't know if it's weird or not, but it didn't stick out its tongue. You know how snakes smell and flicking their tongues? This one didn't. It just kind of looked up, noticed it was being watched, and shot straight under the door. It must have been. I had an unwelcome flashback to Ren's story about the mid-city mauler. The second homeless man, found in pieces behind the boarded-up windows of a vacated tobacco shop. His murderer must have been living there. The most recent story came from Emma, who sat beside me in front of the bar at the drop on 6th Street. She's in her late 30s, a paralegal, and started work on the 5th floor of the Chase building 2 months ago. I doubt she'd be still with the firm. After the experience she described to me, she didn't seem too keen on sticking around Koreatown. The company pays for us to work at Harvard Street, she started. 2 days ago, I got stuck working late. My boss is working on the huge bankruptcy case, and the client loves giving him information around the last minute. I finally left the office at 11. No big deal. The streets are well lit, so I set off for my car by myself. As I walked past the strip of restaurants, I heard whistling. The two same notes over and over, like how you called a dog. I stopped and looked around, but I'm alone on the street. My initial inclination was to walk faster, to assume the whistler was a creep hiding behind the lamppost. And this is a difficult thing to explain. The sound of the whistling felt right. I craved it. I wanted nothing more than to hear it again. It settled on me like honey for my veins. Warm, hypnotic, how anesthesia felt as you go under. Just then, a fire truck flew past me, with its lights on and sirens blaring. I snapped back to reality, except I wasn't on the sidewalk anymore. I was standing in a little alley between the stores, staring at a blue dumpster with a big painted mural of a monkey, maybe 50 feet from the last spot I remembered being. I turned and ran like a fucking cat all the way to my car. It was bizarre. Like I don't remember walking into that alley. I don't know how long I was in that alley. I blocked out. Last time, I was in a trance, controlled out by whatever was doing the whistling. And what would have happened if the fire truck hadn't appeared? Would I be here? I didn't know what to make of Emma. She was ice deep in her third rum and coke as I sat down, and polished off her fourth and fifth as we spoke. And the stories she told me sounded like a perfectly normal occurrence, amplified by the dark and embellished for the sake of a good bar story. She heard a whistle, then she absent-mindedly wandered into an alley. Not exactly the plot of a horror movie. Surprisingly, though, she wasn't even the biggest nut I encountered that night. That honor went to Nancy. I'd seen Nancy before many times. She's 50th, chubby and round. She sits at the wall at the Wilshire/Western Metro station. Hand on the tufty bag beside her as she wore in a pocket of gold. That night, she wore dark cargo pants, a gray sweater, and a bulky, stained military jacket. I stopped outside the gas station to call Jenna. Drunk or not, Emma's account had rattled me. I was apprehensive about going back into our dark apartment alone, and wanted to ask my roommate what time she'd be home. It didn't help that Wilshire was typically empty and quiet, but Jenna didn't pick up, and I was about to reluctantly begin the trek when Nancy addressed me. "Hey, sweetie," she cackled in a deep, throaty voice. I looked at her, fumbling in my purse for $1. "You shouldn't be wandering around alone, sweetie," Nancy continued. "I'm fine," I said kindly. "They watch you, you know." That wiped the smile off my face. Something about the way she said "they" grazed my nerves. You ever notice how many abandoned stores there are around here? Some of them may be empty and rotting for years. A tenant will move in, stay around a few months and bail. You know why? I think rent off Wilshire's is pretty ridiculous, I offered. Nancy gave me a scowl. If that was almost a glare. All the shops have a little apartment upstairs. If you stay out late, sometimes you'll see a light from the second floor window of an abandoned store. And sometimes, if you watch long enough, you'll see figures on the windows. Like people? They're not people, she said forcefully. Their heads are like cones. Their arms wiggle like worms. And there are too many of them. It was the cult. The cult called them with black magic. That's what Louise says. You can ask her herself. And you can't let them see you looking, because they'll come right up to the window and look back. That's how they take control of your mind. Find Louise, she'd tell you. Nancy's statement counterintuitively calmed me. I thought back to something Jenna had told me about the psychiatric patients that she carted around in her ambulance. The bipolar ones on an upswing get paranoid. Mind control is a common delusion. I smiled indulgently at Nancy. I don't think that's possible. She smiled back in a way that was both condescending and helpless. You don't have to believe me, but there's some places even the homeless won't. After my deranged conversation with Nancy, I ran like a madwoman across 3 or 5 blocks to my apartment. At Western and 8th, I heard a sharp whistle, and my heart gulped. I rolled in time to see a girl stroll purposely towards a boy leaning out the window of a stalling car. I stopped. I was driving myself crazy, willingly immersing myself in urban horror, paging for occult nonsense, getting stuck into a disconnected ramblings of a panhandling head case. I decided to end my blog project that night. It was one thing to curl up on the couch with a Stephen King novel, quiet to cast myself at the bumbling white girl who sneaks into a haunted house graveyard and gets eaten by mutant hillbillies. Jenna wasn't there when I returned to my apartment. Still on edge, I went to bed with the hall light on. The excess light may be why I spent the whole night lurching in and out of sleep. And that's why I more than once all but shot up straight in bed. It serves nerves on high alert. I'm sure I'd been roused by somebody whistling trolled melodic notes directly outside their second floor window.